I'm just going to take a minute.
There we go. Okay. And then I have to agree to be. So just know that this is flaming in the background. And I will begin with something that was written 50 years ago. So bear in mind, this is 50 years ago. And it's from the United Nations Environmental Sabbath program. It's not very well publicized, but every June there is an environmental Sabbath. We have forgotten who we are. We have alienated ourselves from the unfolding of the cosmos. We have become estranged from the movements of the earth. We have turned our backs on the cycles of life. We have sought only our own designs and purposes. We have exploited simply for our own ends. We have distorted our knowledge. We have abused our power. Now the land is barren, and the waters are poisoned, and the air is polluted. Now the forests are dying, and the creatures are disappearing, and the humans are despairing. We ask forgiveness. We ask for the gift of remembering. We ask for the strength to change. We have this morning two people who have become experts on how we need to change, and they are Michelle Hamilton and Brian Thornton. Michelle graduated from the University of Washington with an MBA and a Master of Accounting. After a career in finance and then marketing and business at Hewlett-Packard, she became politically active in the climate change movement. She is co-group leader of the Reno Sparks chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, where she is also marketing communications manager. So she is going to display her communications expertise for us this morning. Brian Thornton is a mechanical engineer who has focused on building energy efficiency, leads buildings, commercial solar, and building energy codes. Most recently at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. His current focus is on solving rapid climate change by volunteering for Citizens Climate Lobby. At this point, I should say something about the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit with over 180,000 members. He is also active with the Nevada Department of Environmental Protection's Partners for a Sustainable Nevada, which he has just referred me to, so I'm going to have to bone out now. Brian is working to build support for effective, efficient, and equitable climate change policy, as is Michelle. And so Brian and Michelle, the floor is yours, or the screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us today, Kevin. And thank you so much for that reading. That is so much at the core of how I think so many of us feel. And it's astonishing to me that that was written 50 years ago. Wow. So as you mentioned, Brian and I have spent time thinking about climate, studying it, working to advance climate solutions, but we're not experts. But today,
more than many of us.
And we're really excited to share with you some of the things that we've learned and also some of the resources that we've found that are helpful to us. And I also want to let you know that during this hour, we are going to give all of you a chance to pause and reflect on this material. So before we get started, I would encourage you to have something to write with close by, and also to make sure that your chat is open. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to imagine a decarbonized world. And to help us with this, we're going to listen to a recorded audio clip by Sean Dagu, who is the group leader for the Mid-Hudson South chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. So I want you to take a moment to get settled. Feel your feet on the ground, as Reverend Karen would say. Relax your shoulders. Take a deep breath. Let it out. And if you're comfortable, close your eyes. Sean is going to help us imagine a world with zero greenhouse gas emissions. And I would like to encourage you to engage all of your senses. What does it look like, smell like, sound like? I'm going to share that out.
So one of the things that I found really useful in talking with people is getting them to think about what this world looks like once we've decarbonized it, once we've stopped using fossil fuels. Just start with your day, right? You open your door and you walk out your door, and what's different? What looks different than you've seen before, right? So you got a car in your driveway, and something we know is different is that car is not going to have a tailpipe anymore. What else is different? You're not going to use fossil fuels to heat your home. Houses aren't going to have chimneys. Where we get our electricity from is going to be different. There's going to be no smokestacks on power plants. And if you take those three things, just starting there, you can start to think about, well, what else does that mean? When we take the tailpipes off cars, that means that we're not emitting all of this funky pollution, 6 inches off the ground. And that's a big part of what sort of city smell is. Like, the cities literally smell differently at that point. You close your eyes, the flowers in bloom, the tree blossoms are going to be things that come much more to the forefront because they're not covered in all this other pollution. The horizon changes color. As we stop putting pollution in the air, you won't get the haze on the horizons like you do now. It's going to sound different. The difference between an electric vehicle and a gasoline one driving up the street is huge. And you start multiplying this as you get into these denser city environments, and this whole din of our industry today goes away. And when that drops out, what are you hearing instead? What other voices or noises come to the forefront? Like, what more of nature can you hear?
All right. Beautiful.
Sure.
As we continue in this hour, I want you to hang on to that world that you just imagined, because that's where we're going. And it has a lot to offer. So to get to that world you just imagined, we need to decarbonize. And in order to do that, we need to understand where greenhouse gas emissions come from. So this is a pie chart that shows global greenhouse gas emissions by sector, and it's giving us data for 2016. And what I want you to do is focus on the center of the pie chart, and you'll see that the largest slice of the pie is 73.2%, and that represents global greenhouse gas emissions from energy usage. And then the green slice of the pie is the next largest. That's greenhouse gases emitted by agriculture, forestry, land use. That's about 18%. And you can see that waste from landfills, et cetera, is about 3%. And then industry makes up the rest of it. Now, that's not the energy that industry uses. That is the greenhouse gases emitted in the process of making cement and other chemicals. So even if those industries are using 100% of renewable energy, they are still responsible for 5% of the global greenhouse gases emitted in 2016. Now let's look a little bit more closely at the energy sector. If we start at 12 o'clock, that biggest chunk from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock is energy used by industry. And the next portion of the pie is energy used in transportation. So that's you and I driving our cars, but it's also school buses, trucks, commercial vehicles, etc. And then down at the bottom, you see energy used in buildings. And this is both commercial buildings and residentials. So the places that we live, and then commercial building energy use is about a third, a little bit more than a third of total energy used in buildings. And you can see as we go along the pie chart that there are other smaller sectors. But I want you to back up for a moment and ask yourself, how much direct control do you have over these emissions? As individuals, it's clear that we need to make changes, but there are much bigger changes that need to be made throughout society, right? We need to change our economy, we need to change government policies, and we need to change our habits and our choices. But individuals alone are not going to solve the problem. So don't be fooled by fossil fuel firms who have spent literally billions of dollars over many decades to deny climate change outright or to shift responsibility onto consumers. And if you want to learn more about the types of advertising campaigns or dig deeper into some investigative reporting into this, you can check out these resources. All right. That was a lot to absorb. So I want you to take a breath while you ask yourself, how are you feeling about all this? I'm going to read a sentence and I want you to fill in the blank. And if you're comfortable, please type your response into the chat. When I think about climate change, I feel feel free to type it into the chat if you would like. But think about this. When I think about climate change, how do I feel? I'm starting to see some responses coming into the chat. Overwhelmed, scared, helpless, despair. Lots of people feeling overwhelmed. I can relate to that. Sometimes I get choked up. Frustrated, you bet. Depressed and angry as hell. Amen, sister. Yeah, there's so much that needs to be done. Scared for the future of my grandson. Yeah, I feel the same way. We have kids. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Active hope is something that we all need. And I am going to share with you a quote from this book, Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy, by Joanna, Macy, and Chris Johnstone. Our world is heating up. Deserts are expanding and extreme weather events are becoming more common. Human population and consumption are increasing, while essential resources like fresh water, fish stocks, and topsoil are declining. Given these adversities, it is no surprise if we experience a profound loss of confidence in the future. We can no longer take it for granted that the resources we depend on will be available in the future. And because it's considered too depressing to talk about, it tends to remain an unspoken presence in the backs of our minds. And when we do face the problem, it feels overwhelming. We may wonder whether we can do anything about it anyway. So we now acknowledge that our times confront us with realities that are painful to face, difficult to take in, and confusing to live with. Moreover, every social issue we face is made worse by climate change. Housing, immigration, poverty, racism, the list goes on. So we need tools to strengthen us on this journey because it's not easy. Tools like community. And so the first resource that I would like to offer to you is the book Active Hope, because it is about coping with these very strong emotions and building the strength to do this work over the long haul. Because we need a lot of people, we need a lot of helping hands. So I'm gonna, they also have a website, and I just dropped that link in the chat. And remember that hope is an action. You are not alone in your concerns. I mean, we saw that in the chat, but if we look at the broader sentiment out in the community, we find the same thing. So the Yale program on climate change communication and the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University have been tracking attitudes about climate change for a decade. And the data we're looking at here is from 2015 to 2020. And I want to turn your attention to the top of the chart, which is the percent of people who are dismissive of climate change. And I'd like to point out to you that that's a pretty small percent. And that percent is shrinking. Down at the bottom of the chart, we see that concern or outright alarm over climate change is increasing. And in fact, the majority of people are either alarmed or concerned. Now, if we were to look back to 2014, 1 year before this chart, we would see that the percent of people who are alarmed about climate change has gone up 15%. And people who are alarmed or concerned are fully convinced of the reality and seriousness of climate change. So we are not alone. We are not alone. Do you talk about concerns? Do you talk about climate change? So even though concern is rising, unfortunately, most Americans rarely or never discuss climate change. And if we don't talk about climate change, it's easy to believe that we're alone in our concern. But we just saw that most Americans are concerned or even alarmed by this problem. So I'd like to read a quote to you. The majority of Americans who are concerned about climate change are ignorant of the fact that they are a plurality. This misconception is self-reinforcing, resulting in a spiral of science. This is a quote from John Cook, who is also at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University and has spent much of his academic career studying this. So misinformation is not the only problem we have to worry about. Silence is also a problem. And studies show that just talking about climate change leads to greater acceptance of climate science. So the more we talk about it, the more we normalize our collective understanding that this is a serious problem that the majority of people are worried about. So I would like to encourage all of you to have an additional conversation about climate change in the next week. Now, it doesn't have to be confrontative. You don't have to convert somebody who's dismissive. In fact, you probably shouldn't bother because they're not paying any attention, right? But there are a lot of people who are alarmed or concerned. They're ready to take action, but they haven't gotten out of that sense of fear or anger or frustration or feelings of being overwhelmed. So start with common values that you share with that person, like protecting the people and places we love. Really listen to what they're saying. You could simply express concern about climate change, or you could mention a recent story in the news about climate change. I mean, there's so many to choose from these days. It's pretty easy to do. And there's no doubt that some people are harder to talk to than others. And so again, I would refer you to John Cook, and he has a book out called The Cranky Uncle. And I'm gonna drop that website into the chat as well. All right. So sadly, lots of environmentalists don't even vote. Back in 2014, 15.78 million environmentalists did not vote. If we look at 2016, 10 million registered voters who named the environment as their top priority did not vote. So I would like to remind you that the last presidential election was won by only 7 million votes. So these numbers that we're looking at here in terms of people who are concerned about climate, who are environmentalists, and who aren't voting, that's a big number. And if you don't vote, you don't have a voice. In fact, politicians only poll likely voters. So opinions of voters have a much higher value to candidates. And if voters are not demanding environmental leadership, then politicians don't have a mandate to act like leaders. So let's get out there and vote. All right. The other thing that is really important after you voted is to talk to your government. Call, write, meet with your legislators at all levels of government. Nevada is awesome. Our members of Congress are so accessible. And you can go even further than that. You can join committees and working groups like the ones that Kevin and Brian were talking about. You can also write letters to the editor because the paper publishes letters which reflect a broad sentiment in the community. So if you see a climate denial letter in the newsletter, by all means, write a rebuttal. Or if you see a story in the paper about climate change, write a letter. They'll publish it. And I want to say that the first time I ever called a member of Congress was about a year ago. And I have to tell you that I was terrified, absolutely terrified. And I made that phone call. The person on the other end of the phone was so nice. They basically took down all my information, wrote down what I had to say, and then politely said, thank you. It could not have been easier. And when I got off the phone, the whole thing took me about 5 minutes. I had to ask myself why it had taken me so long to do that. So please call your member of Congress monthly. All right. You can also join in the community of activists. Citizens Climate Lobby is the organization that Brian and I volunteer for. We advocate for carbon fee and dividend legislation, which I'll talk more about next. If you are a conservative environmentalist, then check out Republic EN, which is also in favor of carbon fee and dividend legislation. Climate Reality, of course, is known for their leadership corps that trains people worldwide so they can raise awareness and influence public opinion in their community. And the Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion are both led by younger millennials and Zoomers and are a force to be reckoned with. So definitely find a community that fits for you and join in the community of climate activists. So as I mentioned, Brian and I volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby, and we support carbon fee and dividend legislation. And this all goes back to the fact that dumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere causes climate change and air pollution. And fossil fuel companies are selling us this product that causes harm to others who have absolutely no control over how the product is created. And this is what economists call a market failure or an externality. And the harm that's being caused is significant, right? There's the damage from climate fuel disasters. There's also all the investment that we now need to make in climate adaptation. I mean, the city of Miami is going to have to raise their sidewalks a whole lot more than they already are once these glaciers start to melt. And then there's the healthcare costs associated with all of that air pollution that I'm sure Kevin could tell us a lot about. So economists have long stated that a carbon tax is the most effective tool to reduce carbon emissions at the necessary scale and speed. And this is the really important piece, the necessary scale and speed. A carbon tax forces us to recognize the full cost of burning fossil fuels in the selling product, in the selling price of that product, which means that everyone is going to think twice before they buy it. So utilities, for example, are going to have a very different financial picture when they compare renewables to fossil fuels, which will now be more expensive. And that's going to encourage substitution. It's also going to encourage efficiency and conservation as it starts to make more sense to do things like energy retrofits. And then, of course, it's going to encourage innovation because it's very much going to change the financial equation, and it's going to open up opportunities for new technologies and new industries. Moreover, if all of that tax revenue is given to households, those payments will essentially cover the increased costs for 85% of households. And this is a really important piece because lower income households contribute very little to the overall problem. And so they should not disproportionately bear the cost of the solution. So if you want to find out more about carbon pricing, carbon fee and dividend, then I've dropped a link into the chat. And if you agree with this policy, then by all means, call your member of Congress and tell them so. And I just dropped a link into the chat that will help you do that. Oh, I'm sorry. I neglected to mention two things. And one of them is that the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is the specific piece of legislation that Citizens Climate Lobby advocates, and that was endorsed both by the UUFNN board and by Reverend Karen. All right, now that was a lot of information that I just flew through at you. And so now I want you to take a moment to reflect. And I'm going to give you a full minute to journal or just think about this in your mind. Have you found a way to face this mess without going crazy? Are you talking about climate change enough to your family, to your friends, to members of Congress? Is climate change a voting issue for you? And which community of climate activists have you joined? Can you step up your involvement? All right, I'm going to go on mute to give you guys a chance to reflect for a minute. All right. Thank you, everyone, for taking some time to reflect on how to build strength for this work and how to work in community to create climate solutions. So even though individuals alone are not going to solve this problem, our choices and habits do matter. And to live in a world with net zero carbon emissions, everyone is going to need to adapt and to make changes. And that's what Brian's going to talk about.
Thank you, Michelle. So as Michelle said, we're going to talk a little bit about our individual carbon footprints and some of the things we can focus on for that. To start with, it's important to understand what a carbon footprint is. And basically, it's the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the things that we do, the things that we buy. There are kind of two types of carbon footprint components. The first are those direct emissions that we burn fossil fuels directly, like in a car or in a furnace. Then there are all the indirect emissions that are called embodied carbon. And basically, because our economy runs on fossil fuels, everything we buy and every service that we take part in has a carbon footprint. And so the more you spend, the bigger your carbon footprint. There is an interesting resource called How Bad Are Bananas that looks at the carbon footprint of all kinds of things, and it can give you a sense of the scale and the trade-offs over things. Michelle will put the link to that in the chat. Carbon footprint varies by household, and as I mentioned, it typically increases significantly as income increases. This graph shows the typical carbon footprint by household being 2 to 3 people on average, and shows that increase going from the basic average income in Nevada is around 45,000 median household income until the top of the graph. It also gives a simple breakdown into categories. So food, housing, transportation are the main ones for most households. If your income is lower, your carbon footprint is likely smaller, and your efforts may be better focused on political movement, political involvement, like Michelle talked about, rather than your own emissions. Putting this in the global perspective, we sometimes hear in the news now that China has the highest total greenhouse gas emissions, but the US is still number 2 overall. And with an average of about 16 tons of CO2 equivalent per person, the US remains by far the highest per person, over twice that of China. The US also still has by far the largest accumulated greenhouse gas emissions, which is the overall impact. As Americans, we have a special responsibility to work on this problem. So how can you understand your own carbon footprint? If you go online, there are actually dozens of reasonable resources to look at to explore this question. You can also just consider a graph like the one that I showed on the previous page. There is a pretty good tool if you do want to get a little more quantitative and look at it a little more closely. This tool also actually has a really simple way of kind of coming up with a default that's scaled to your income and household. The point of all this isn't to feel guilty about what you've done in the past or what you are going to do in the future. It's to try to understand where the biggest impact is that you can work on, what's most important. And you may find as well, if you've already done some things like bought an electric car or put in a heat pump, that your footprint is relatively small. And in that case, it certainly makes more sense to go after the political system and change the whole society rather than worrying too much about one aluminum can or something like that. Let's take a quick tour of the Cool Climate Calculator. There are 6 main tabs across the top. Getting started is shown here. There's travel, which includes all of your transportation, home, food, and shopping, which is where you enter most of your household inputs to come up with your greenhouse gases. And then there's also an interesting feature on this one called Take Action, which helps you look at specific things you can do and estimates the impact given your situation. The chart on the right provides a breakdown of your carbon footprint by category. At the top of the chart is a total. And as you work with the tool or try things, you'll see that total go up or down. You can get a reasonable estimate of your footprint just by doing this first screen, which has only 3 simple inputs. where you live, which you put in with a zip code, how many people are in your household, and your gross annual household income. And for some of us as retirees, we don't have a traditional income. You can instead, if you have a good idea of what your total spending is, that's another way of kind of getting at that. For more detail than this basic estimate, you can work through the different tabs and enter things as you go. And it doesn't take that long. I mean, it's a little hard if you don't have any idea what your spending is. You got to look through things, but you can get some of the big things, like maybe you have an idea of how many miles you drive, and you can calculate gas and things like that. So it's worth taking a look at in any case. Note on the graph that if you hover over these boxes with your mouse, you'll actually get a quantitative number, which might be easier to consider. So the purpose of that exercise, and even the general case, is to get an idea of what are the big categories that you control. This is for a typical renal household, as I said, around a median income of about $45,000 and about 2.5 people. And for this, the top 5 and the biggest is car fuel, which is most of our fossil fuel usage for homes directly. Natural gas, or that could be heating oil if you have an oil furnace, and electricity for things like lights and appliances and air conditioning. Under food, typically in most people's diet, meat is by far their biggest greenhouse gas contributor. And then air travel. And air travel will vary a lot depending on just how much air travel you're doing. It may be the biggest category for you. On the right, some of the big categories are goods and services, but those are a lot harder to change other than simply spending less money. And for those, the thing to work on are the kinds of things that Michelle talked about. As the whole system changes and renewable energy becomes the way we do things and other changes are made, those goods and services embodied carbon will go down. And so that's probably the best way to work on those things. If you do explore this in more detail, you may find that other categories are larger for you. If you have a lot of land and do a lot of irrigation, this water category may become a large part of your thing. And what that's from is the energy used to pump and move water around. And as I mentioned, air travel could be the biggest category for you. Unfortunately, with air travel, the only way to control it is to do less, or again, change the system so that airlines use renewable fuels and that kind of thing. So let's take a couple of minutes thinking about the implications of this for our own lives, and just think about, are there things in here that we can work on today? Is your household significantly different than this typical household? And if so, maybe it's worth taking the time to do a little bit of a calculation. And then what things can we work on over time? Michelle and I have worked on some of the things we're going to talk about, but not all of them. We just have sort of a plan for how we're going to try to do things over time, because some of the changes take time and money. And then, so maybe over the next 5 years, what can you think about? If your footprint is already small, you've already taken some steps, like you ride a bike or you have an electric car, it may be more important to think about how you can get involved in activism or reaching out to your government officials. So what is your next step? I'm going to go on mute for a moment and let everybody reflect on that. Right. Thank you for giving that some thought. Now we're going to talk about some of those big items and some of the steps you could take to work on those. As I mentioned, car fuel is typically the largest category. And so the way to deal with that is to give up, and this is what the future will eventually look like if we reach net zero, there won't be any fossil fuel use in vehicles. And so things you can look at is an electric bike for when you have short errands around town, or a regular bike if that's comfortable for you. But electric bike can make it a little easier to go up hills and things. There also are electric mopeds and motorcycles, which can be a little more comfortable for some of us. And then finally, there are all electric cars, which we're all hearing a lot about. In Nevada, because things are so spread out, it may be if you have to travel a lot in the countryside, it may be hard to find electric chargers. So an option that works great for local travel, but then also has gasoline for longer travel is what's called a plug-in hybrid. And a plug-in hybrid, you actually plug it in an outlet at home, or you can get a high-speed charger with some extra work. And those cars can get 30 miles on the electric charge, which turns out to be plenty for getting around town, for doing your errands and that kind of thing. So, and that's what we have at this point as a plug-in hybrid. Their regular hybrids are just more like a more efficient gasoline car that you can't plug in, but they do get good gas mileage. So this chart basically shows us that driving an electric vehicle, the smaller and the lighter, the better. And what it has on the vertical axis on the left is the amount of emissions. So with a standard gasoline powered car getting 20 miles per gallon, if you drive that 1,000 miles, you produce almost over half a ton of greenhouse gases. If we go further right and we look at an electric sedan, number 7, that's an all-electric car. Now we've reduced the footprint almost by a quarter using regular utility electricity. So there is still some greenhouse gases from the emissions from the electric plant. And then all the way at the bottom, we have an electric bicycle, which essentially has no carbon footprint compared to a car. But again, there is some from the use of electricity on the grid. The dollar signs across the top are an estimate of energy cost or fuel cost. That was actually done at $3 a gallon, which we know is not current. So those numbers are actually higher now. So what this tells us is not only can you have a dramatic reduction in your your carbon footprint, but you can also save a lot of money by moving to electric vehicles. If you do use renewable electricity, and we'll talk about some ways to do that at the end, the carbon footprint from electric vehicles becomes negligible. There's still some because there is embodied carbon in the production of solar cells and all of that. But essentially, those bars go almost to zero if you're using renewable electricity. So switching over to the home, which is natural gas or heating oil and electricity, there is kind of a process you can go through to look at your impact and how to reduce it. And the big idea here again is to get rid of fossil fuels. So if you've got a furnace or a heating oil furnace or a natural gas furnace, that's the focus. But let me just say, if you're renting or you have a condo, you may not be able to get at these things. And so it would make sense for you to focus on other things. Or you may be able to influence a landlord or a homeowners association over time to move in these directions. The first step is to get some sort of energy audit or assessment. If you look for that online, you can find vendors, and NV Energy itself will provide a basic free energy assessment of your property. So we first want to reduce our heating and cooling needs, because if we do replace the equipment in our house with a heat pump or something, you want that to be as small as possible. And it's going to be cheaper to do some insulation and some other things to bring that cost down. The first thing to focus on is the attic. That's the biggest impact. Other kinds of insulation are harder to install. If you have old windows, like aluminum windows, that's definitely worth doing. It's an expensive project, but it also will make you more comfortable, as well as significantly reducing your loads. And then finally, if you have a ducted furnace system in your house with air registers, often those systems are extremely leaky, and much of what you're doing is being wasted going into your attic or going into the crawl space. And so having those ducts sealed can be a big impact and reduce the size of equipment you need. And then we actually want to get rid of the fossil fuels. And so that's where heat pumps come in. And it's not brand new, they're relatively new in Nevada, but there are what are called low temperature heat pumps. And those are modern, very efficient heat pumps, which operate down to -15 degrees. And they maintain their capacity down to 0 to 5 degrees. And those units don't need very much backup electric heat, and they're designed for a colder climate. Those are temperatures that can be reached here, but partly because of climate change, aren't being reached here anymore. Typically, the lows are in the teens, in which case these modern heat pumps work just fine. On the other side too, most of us heat hot water in a water heater, often that uses fossil fuels. So a gas water heater, or maybe you have a standard electric resistance water heater. Well, there are modern heat pump water heaters that are very efficient that would allow you to get rid of the natural gas, or would be much more efficient than a standard electric resistance water heater. If you want to take it all the way and really get rid of the fossil fuels in your house, maybe you have a gas fireplace or you have a gas stove. There are good electric alternatives to those now as well. Michelle is an avid cook, and we have an modern electric range top, and she finds that she has just as much control over the temperature as she did years ago when we lived in a house with a gas stove. Once we've converted everything to electricity, you want to look at switching to renewable electricity, or you can even start there to reduce the impact of your current electric needs from appliances and lights. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So most of us see houses with solar panels on the roof, and that's an important and useful step if you want to go that route. There are ways to do that using a lease, so you don't have that huge upfront cost, and that's worth exploring. There's also another alternative that you can do anytime, do it now, called the Northern Nevada Green Energy Choice Program from NV Energy. And there's an online sign up, or you can make a phone call. Michelle will put a link to this online. And you have the option of paying an additional amount on your electricity bill for every kilowatt hour to get renewable energy, either 100% or 50%. The cost is significant, although it's not like doubling or anything like that. I think it adds about 10%. It varies depending on the cost of renewables. It's a pretty robust program. NV Energy cannot use that renewable energy for any other purpose. They can't claim it for their renewable portfolio standard or other programs that they're required to meet. Obviously, the electrons are all mixed together, in the wires. You're not going to it's not like having a dedicated system. But what you're doing is forcing NV Energy to move more and more towards renewable. If 100% of us signed up for this, NV Energy would have to have 100% renewable energy. They would have to put up enough power plants to do that overnight. They're already moving in that direction. About 25% of NV Energy is currently renewables, and they have a plan to go further, but we can help push them faster by doing this. I've heard people say they've had a little trouble getting signed up. We signed up some time ago and it works well for us, but just be patient. If you have to make some phone calls to get it done, go ahead and do that. And as I said, it's worth exploring doing your own solar panels, which we eventually hope to do, but we probably need a new roof at the same time. So it's a big project. As we mentioned, food is one of the other large categories for most of us. In the average American diet, which this pie chart shows, meat is by far the largest greenhouse gas emitter, and dairy makes up another quarter. So together, animal products make up about 3/4 of our carbon footprint in our diet. Here's another way of looking at this. The height of these bar charts is pounds of CO2 per serving. And the biggest by far is beef, and lamb is similar. So you do hear about this in the news, that these things have a big impact, and quantitatively, they do. There may be options eventually to get lower greenhouse impact meats like this, but right now, they're at the top of the chart. Other meats, which you could substitute for, you don't have to completely go vegetarian, are poultry and pork are considerably lower, or even some of the dairy products, although cheese is pretty high. You can substitute beans, lentils, nuts, grilled veggies for some of that grilling taste, and just make meat portions smaller. You know, it's still okay to have a little bit, maybe a stir fry, things like that. And as you move down the train to the vegetables, you see down here that the carbon footprint per serving is extremely low compared to any meat product. And there are other reasons for doing this too, in terms of health and other environmental impacts like water and fertilizers and pollution from those things. So it's worth considering some shifting in diet. You don't have to do it all overnight, but over time, maybe look at some options.
There's 10 minutes left.
Okay. All right, so no matter what we do, we're not going to eliminate our carbon footprint. You know, everything we buy, everything we do has a carbon footprint. There is an option that will allow you to make some attempt to do something directly to compensate for that. And those are called individual carbon offsets. These are programs where you can purchase projects, basically do a share in renewable energy projects, pollution reduction projects, et cetera, which offset a portion of your carbon footprint. There is some criticism of these, particularly at the corporate level, where they've been used to meet national cap and trade programs. But some of these individual programs are dedicated to the individual market. They have independent certifications and are reasonably legitimate, and they tell you how they spend the money. So it is worth exploring this. Obviously, this is not a panacea. It's not a way of not doing anything else. You still want to work on your own carbon footprint. You still want to work on changing society and the systems to substitute or to make the changes that are needed. But it is a useful way of doing something, and you can do this tomorrow. Again, it's something you can do immediately. And because of the uncertainty of it, we actually pay twice our carbon footprint that isn't met by other purposes. So, okay, so we've covered some ground here. There are so many things you can look at in addition to this online. Look under energy efficiency projects, look under water saving. There's lots of things you can do in your day-to-day life to make it more sustainable. I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle now to take us to the end.
Thanks, Brian. As Brian mentioned, there are so many details that you can get into in terms of reducing your own greenhouse gas emissions. And we touched on some of the most important ones today. But our hope was to give you a framework to think about this so that in your own lives, you're tackling the biggest pieces in your own lives, and also recognizing that individuals alone are not going to solve the problem. We have to do this in community. And that means reaching out to our politicians and actively engaging in the work of changing our society. And we started this whole adventure by looking really closely at our own feelings and emotions around this, because we have to stay strong in order to do this work. And that means using our imagination, like the world that you stepped into for 2 minutes when we went through that visualization exercise. So I want to end where we began, by talking about hope, imagination, and action with a quote from Neil Gaiman. We all have the obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It's easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that society is huge, and the individual is less than nothing. But the truth is, individuals make the future. And they do it by imagining that things can be different. Act on your vision. All right, so we're going to close the forum today in a slightly different way, which is by asking you to share with us some of the things that you've done. I've seen some of the things going by in chat. And also, if you're willing to share what you might do moving forward, having spent some time reflecting on things, what are some of the things that you might do moving forward? You can always ask questions.
Should I take it off? Sure.
And if you're still absorbing, that's okay too. Kevin, what I'm going to do after this call is I'm going to send a document to you that has all the resources that we listed out in the chat. So if you want to distribute that to the forum, you're more than welcome to do that.
Okay, so if there's anyone here who is not on our email list, please let me know, and I'll add your email address to our list so that you get everything that Michelle has asked me to distribute. And my email address is fkevinmurphymd@hotmail.com, and I'll put that in the chat, I guess. Yeah. All right.
Do you see a question in the chat, Brian, that comes up often, which is, can you give us an idea of what services means?
Yeah, I mean, services are lots of things. You know, it's like every time you go to the doctor, that would be a service. Things like talking to an advisor for something. Going to a restaurant, you know, is kind of a combination. Some of that is food, but really a lot of about 2/3 of the cost of going to a restaurant is really services. Going to a movie. So basically, a lot of the things we just go out and do and spend money on that isn't going to end up with a thing, a good that's in hand. In our case, putting our kids through college is a service, and that has a big impact because it's keeping people employed and running buildings and everything else. So
I guess we'd also add the banking industry and the insurance industry, right?
yeah, investment, the costs of investments for those who are living on investments. There's a percentage of that goes to paying for people to do that work. I noticed a couple of things in the chat I just wanted to highlight. It does sound like some people are working towards electric cars. Someone is replacing a furnace with a heat pump. That's great. Others have done more efficient gas furnaces, and that's a good step. That's an important step because there definitely are gains to be made there. And earlier, I think someone was talking about helping their community create a recycling program. And there is a lot of embodied energy in all the goods, all the packaging and everything. So moving towards recycling actually has a big impact. There's something that you might want to look into called building a circular economy, which potentially can have a transformative effect so that everything that we use gets returned back into the system rather than thrown away. Let's see.
Yeah, I see.
Are there any other questions?
I really appreciate all the thoughts that people have been dropping into chat. It's another way that we can express this work in community is leaning into one another and leaning into and sharing the things that we've learned. So thank you for engaging in that activity with us today.
There's a question about waste management. I don't have a definitive answer. My understanding is that they recycle what they can. Part of what happened was China stopped taking material from the US a number of years ago. And so again, as we talk about building a circular economy, part of what needs to happen now is for those supply chains to recognize that there are these streams of material now that are starting to accumulate and aren't necessarily getting used. But I'm sure that they capture things like aluminum, which has high value, and they probably capture all the steel, which has a value. They may not do a very good job of capturing things like plastic because there's just not a good market. It's hard to recycle that stuff.
Robin says use less plastic. I agree.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, this work is not easy. We are in it for the long haul. This work will not be done when I leave this planet. And so I appreciate the effort that each and every one of you puts into this because it's super important for the generations that follow, both human and animal and plant.
Well, Michelle and Brian, thank you very much for helping us to become engaged in helping to heal the planet. And let me say that we're going to take a break for the holidays. And that's because a number of years ago, I gave a Sunday forum between Christmas and New Year's, and the audience consisted of my wife and Bruce Stone. So we don't do that anymore. And our next Sunday forum will be January 16th, and it will be Angela Taylor, Dr. Angela Taylor, talking about teaching about race in Washoe County schools. So I hope you'll all be there and bring your friends, January 16th. And again, Brian and Michelle, thank you very, very much. And Michelle, I'll get your list of resources out to the Sunday Forum friends. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to put my email in the chat if people have follow-up questions.
Okay. Well, I see there's a breakout room option, so I'll just open it and see what happens. Well, I guess we're now in a breakout room. I don't understand any of this. Dan, are you still with us?
I am still here.
Oh, okay. So do you understand this breakout room thing?
Well, ordinarily it would it would divide people down and send them out into breakout rooms, but we only have a couple of minutes here and I'm going to have to shut down. I have to participate in the service in a couple of moments.
Okay.
So.
All right. So can the breakout room continue without you, or how does that work?
I suspect it probably can. It will be unmoderated and unmonitored. So if anyone starts misbehaving, it's going to be up to you to get it under control.
Yeah, I'd worry a lot about Betty Hulse, I think. So, well, yeah, I guess we can just, it'll just go away when we all check out by clicking leave room in a few minutes. Is that right?
Sure. And that being the case, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point. There's no need to record.
Oh, of course. Of course.